Some mornings arrive quietly. Others come dragging trouble behind them. You can hear it before you see it. Diesel engines rumbling, metal tracks grinding across gravel, workers avoiding eye contact because deep down they know they shouldn't be there. The morning they tore out my sister's wheelchair ramp started at 6 o'clock sharp. Delilah was still inside wearing pajama pants when the bulldozer rolled onto her property. Meanwhile, the HOA president stood in the yard holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of smug smile you'd expect from someone overseeing a flower bed installation, not the destruction of the only safe way a disabled woman could enter and leave her home. And somehow it got worse. After the ramp was gone, he handed her an invoice for the demolition. Yes, an actual bill. My name is Marcus. And if you told me 3 years ago that I'd be standing outside breathing diesel fumes while listening to my sister cry as $8,000 worth of accessibility equipment was shredded into scrap metal, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I would have said people that heartless couldn't possibly exist in a neighborhood like Riverside Heights. But Riverside Heights wasn't what it used to be. The subdivision sat in a quiet corner of Missouri. Nothing fancy. Just 2 neat rows of homes, trimmed hedges, and neighbors who used to wave when they passed by. The kind of place where people actually knew each other. My sister Delilah and I owned 2 neighboring houses there. Our parents left them to us after they died in a car accident. One terrible night. One devastating phone call. After that, it was just the 2 of us trying to rebuild a life from the pieces that remained. I worked construction. Always had. Delilah was the intellectual of the family. Quiet, thoughtful, and far smarter than me. She worked in government policy, or at least that's how she described it. Most of the time she talked about regulations, appropriations committees, and meetings that sounded painfully boring to me. I never paid much attention. I figured she spent her days pushing paperwork, while the rest of us did the real work. Turns out I was completely wrong. But that lesson came later. About 18 months after our parents passed away, a drunk driver ran a red light near Miller's Grocery and slammed into Delilah's car. The impact crushed the vehicle like an empty soda can. She spent 4 months in the hospital and another 6 months in rehabilitation, learning how to navigate a body that no longer responded the way it once had. For nearly a year, our lives revolve around hospital corridors. The smell of disinfectant, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the endless beeping of monitors throughout the night. When the doctors finally cleared her to return home, I decided she deserved more than the bare minimum. So I built her a ramp. Not one of those cheap plywood structures people throw together in an afternoon. A real ramp. The incline was perfect. The railings met every requirement. The surface was slip-resistant. And I even painted the trim to match the house. I pulled permits through the city and made sure every detail met code. More than that, I wanted it to look good. I wanted Delilah's first day home to feel like the beginning of a new chapter rather than a reminder of everything she'd lost. The first time she rolled up that ramp, she started crying before she reached the front door. Seeing that moment made every hour of work worth it. I'd have spent twice as much money to give her that feeling. What neither of us knew was that the HOA had mailed their architectural review notice to the wrong address. Instead of sending it to our house at 274 Maple, they mailed it to 247 Maple. A simple mistake. At least that's what a reasonable person would have called it. Bryce Kellerman wasn't a reasonable person. Bryce was the kind of guy who treated tucked-in polo shirts like a personality trait. He drove a spotless white Lexus as if cleanliness itself proved moral superiority, and he spoke in a thin, nasal voice that made every sentence sound like a formal complaint. 38 years old, recently divorced, freshly elected HOA president, and completely intoxicated by the tiny amount of authority that came with carrying a clipboard. Bryce loved enforcement. Grass an inch too tall? Warning letter. Christmas lights still hanging after New Year's? Violation notice. A kid leaves a bicycle in the driveway overnight. Apparently that was a neighborhood emergency. He didn't just enjoy rules. He enjoyed watching people submit to them. The moment he discovered Delilah's ramp had city approval but lacked HOA approval, he saw an opportunity. There would be no grace period, no discussion, no chance to file retroactively, no common sense, just a bulldozer arriving at dawn. I stepped outside to the crunch of gravel beneath heavy equipment, and the sharp smell of diesel exhaust. And there was Delilah, still wearing her oversized t-shirt and pajama pants, sitting helplessly in her wheelchair near the front door, watching strangers destroy the very thing that gave her freedom. Meanwhile, Bryce stood nearby with that clipboard tucked beneath his arm, smiling like he'd accomplished something important. When the demolition ended, he walked over and handed her an itemized bill for $2,200, as if he were doing her a favor. Then came the fines. $200 per day until the violation was corrected. That was the part that made my blood boil the most. Not just the cruelty, the performance of it. Bryce wanted people watching. That was the whole point. He wanted every neighbor in Riverside Heights to see exactly what happened when somebody challenged his authority. And Delilah, she simply accepted the paperwork, nodded once, and quietly asked how much time she had before payment was due. That scared me more than Bryce ever could. My sister used to dismantle college professors for fun. She could sit through a meeting full of executives, politicians, and attorneys and make them sweat with a single raised eyebrow and one perfectly timed question. But now she sat there motionless, calm, silent, while a self-important HOA president humiliated her in front of the neighborhood. For a moment, I wondered if the accident had damaged more than her body. Maybe it had taken something else from her, too. What I didn't realize was that Delilah wasn't defeated. She was preparing. Over the next few days, she spent hours behind the closed door of her home office making phone calls. Quiet conversations. Focused conversations. The kind where her voice became lower, calmer, and far more dangerous. Every now and then I catch fragments while passing through the hallway. Federal compliance requirements, accessibility enforcement, oversight review, appropriations committee. I assumed she was speaking with disability attorneys. Meanwhile, Bryce assumed she was harmless. Poor guy had no idea what was coming. 3 days after the ramp demolition, Bryce returned. This time he brought a lawyer. His name was Trevor. He had greasy hair, a wrinkled polyester suit, and enough cologne to fumigate an entire neighborhood. The two of them stood on our porch looking like collection agents. Trevor informed us that the balance had increased to $3,400 due to additional fines and removal costs. Then he explained that if payment wasn't received within 72 hours, the HOA would begin placing liens against both properties, not just Delilah's house. Mine, too. As if that wasn't ridiculous enough, Trevor claimed the permits I'd obtained to the city were somehow fraudulent. According to him, I had apparently orchestrated an elaborate scheme involving a wheelchair ramp. That was the exact moment my anger turned into curiosity. Construction teaches you certain things. One lesson stands above the rest. Whenever someone starts throwing rules around like weapons, it's worth checking whether they're following those same rules themselves. So that evening, while Delilah worked behind her office door making mysterious phone calls, I headed down to City Hall. I spent hours under buzzing fluorescent lights digging through public records. Eventually, I found exactly what I was looking for. Bryce had built a large deck behind his house 8 months earlier. There was no HOA architectural approval on file. None. And it got better. The deck violated city setback requirements by 3 feet. The same man who called my sister's fully permitted accessibility ramp illegal had built his own project without approval and in direct violation of city code. That discovery opened a much larger door. The more records I reviewed, the uglier things became. I found 6 additional homeowners with approval issues similar to ours. Sheds, pergolas, room additions, patio extensions. Every single one of them had received a friendly notice and a 30-day grace period to correct the issue. No bulldozers, no daily fines, no public humiliation, just flexibility and common sense. Apparently, those privileges apply to everyone except us. When I showed Delilah everything I'd uncovered, she studied the paperwork quietly. Then she smiled. Not a happy smile, not a relieved smile. The kind of smile that should make a person nervous. "That's interesting, Marcus," she said softly. "Very interesting." Then she closed her office door and made another phone call. After that, something started changing in the neighborhood. Mrs. Morgan, who lived across the street, revealed she'd filmed much of the demolition from her kitchen window. Pete from the hardware store stopped by carrying a bag of screws, and offered to help rebuild a ramp at no charge. One evening, we found an unsigned note slipped beneath our front door. It read, "Others have been targeted too. You're not alone." The mood throughout Riverside Heights was shifting. You could feel it. People were tired of the warnings, tired of the threats, tired of living under Bryce's personal kingdom. And the more support we received, the nastier he became. He filed complaints with the city in an attempt to have my contractor's license reviewed. He increased the daily fines. Then he organized a special HOA meeting at the community center. The place smelled like stale coffee, dusty carpet, and old frustration. Bryce arrived carrying a laptop and a PowerPoint presentation titled Maintaining Community Standards. Apparently, cruelty feels more professional when accompanied by slides. About 40 residents showed up. Bryce stood at the front of the room clicking through photographs of my sister's demolished ramp as though he were presenting evidence in a criminal trial. He called it an unauthorized structure. He called it an eyesore. He even called it a safety hazard. Then he looked directly at Delilah and delivered his favorite kind of speech. Some residents, he said, believe they can ignore community rules and then play the victim when accountability catches up to them. I was on my feet before he finished the sentence. My chair nearly flipped backward. I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector. Then I started presenting my own slideshow. Photos, permit records, inspection dates, approval histories. One piece at a time, I laid out the entire pattern. Mrs. Patterson's shed received leniency. The Johnson family's pergola received leniency. Bryce's illegal deck received complete invisibility. Yet somehow a disabled woman's wheelchair ramp was demolished before sunrise. Funny how regulations become strictest when the person being targeted is least able to fight back. For a moment, I honestly thought I had him. I really did. The room had gone quiet except for the sound of people whispering to one another. Neighbors were turning toward Bryce, and his face had taken on that tight, red look men get when they realize the spotlight has suddenly shifted onto them. For a few seconds, it seemed like the entire thing was falling apart around him. Then he played his backup card. 5 investors who had been quietly purchasing homes throughout Riverside Heights stood up almost in unison. They were Bryce's reliable voting bloc, the kind of people who talked about community improvement while calculating property values. Expensive loafers, expensive watches, same agenda. Together they motioned to table the discussion and demanded a legal review. Before anyone could object, Bryce announced an emergency enforcement measure. The daily fine jumped from $200 to $500. Just like that. No vote, no real explanation. Just another punishment. The mood in the room changed instantly. Everything felt contaminated, like common sense had packed its bags and left. But Delilah wasn't rattled. She calmly rolled her wheelchair toward the microphone and waited for the room to settle. Then she began asking questions. Not angry questions, not emotional questions. Quiet questions, the dangerous kind. Questions about federal grant compliance. Questions about anti-discrimination obligations. Questions about accessibility standards tied to state funding. Questions about whether the HOA board had documented its review process regarding disability accommodations. Bryce laughed. He dismissed every one of them. But I noticed something. His left eye twitched. Just once. Then again. And it kept happening. Because once Delilah started asking questions, other residents found their voices too. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up and admitted Bryce had fined her over decorative garden gnomes. The Morrisons revealed he'd threatened them over chalk drawings their grandchildren made on the sidewalk. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly started talking. That same night, Mrs. Morgan launched a neighborhood Facebook group. Within hours, dozens of residents joined. A local reporter named Jamie began asking questions about HOA finances. In less than a week, Riverside Heights transformed from a neighborhood full of quiet resentment into a neighborhood organizing itself. People weren't whispering anymore. They were comparing notes. And that's when Bryce made the mistake that ultimately destroyed him. He kept digging into our finances. So I started digging into his. What I uncovered was ugly. The contractor Bryce preferred for landscaping repairs, emergency maintenance projects, and nearly every major HOA expense seemed to appear everywhere. The same company, the same names, the same connections. And every road led back to one of Bryce's closest business associates. The numbers were absurd. Tree removals billed at $8,000 that should have cost $1,200. A fountain repair invoiced at $15,000 for what amounted to replacing a pump. Project after project. Invoice after invoice. The pattern never changed. Inflated contracts. Questionable bids. Money flowing through the same circle of people. It looked less like neighborhood management and more like a private ATM. When I handed Delilah the folder containing everything I'd found, she barely reacted. She wasn't surprised. She looked pleased. That should have warned me. Actually, it was my second warning. The first had been that strange smile she'd given me earlier. The second came a few days later. I walked into her office carrying 2 cups of coffee without bothering to knock. The sight inside nearly made me drop both of them. Delilah was on a video conference. Behind her was official Missouri state letterhead displayed on a large monitor. Across the screen sat a dozen men and women in expensive suits. Every one of them addressed her the same way. Governor. Yes, ma'am. Understood, Governor. I froze in the doorway, coffee in hand, brain completely disconnected. Meanwhile, my wheelchair-bound sister, the quiet one, the private one, the mysterious government policy expert I'd never fully understood, was calmly discussing statewide housing compliance, federal oversight procedures, appropriations reviews, and regulatory enforcement. She sounded less like an employee and more like the person giving orders, because she was. Delilah Morrison wasn't a mid-level government worker. She wasn't an analyst. She wasn't an advisor. She was the governor of Missouri. Second term, still serving, working remotely during recovery after the accident, keeping a low public profile because the crash had already created enough media attention, and she wanted none of it focused on our neighborhood. Suddenly, every piece fell into place. The phone calls, the closed-door meetings, the endless discussions about regulations. Those hadn't been conversations with lawyers. They'd been conversations with investigators, auditors, civil rights specialists, attorney general staff, federal compliance officials, housing oversight teams. And Bryce, in all his tucked-in polo glory, had spent months terrorizing the woman whose office helped oversee funding programs connected to his own HOA. I sat down so fast I missed the chair completely. Wait, I said, you've been the governor this entire time? Delilah looked over the top of her glasses. The expression she gave me was identical to the one a teacher gives a student who just figured out something everyone else already knew. Yes, Marcus. I stared at her. For several seconds, I couldn't think of a single intelligent response. Then she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Sometimes people reveal exactly who they are when they believe there will be no consequences. That hit harder than anything else that happened, because that was the real lesson. Not that power matters. Not that rules can be manipulated. Everybody already knows those things. The real lesson was uglier. Bryce hadn't become cruel because he had authority. He had simply stopped hiding who he already was because he thought nobody important was paying attention. People like Bryce depend on that. They depend on silence, on embarrassment, on isolation, on convincing everyone around them that fighting back isn't worth the effort. They don't just want obedience. They want hopelessness. And Delilah had allowed him to believe he had both. The meeting room was packed. Every chair was taken, and people were standing along the walls shoulder to shoulder. The air buzzed with nervous energy, camera flashes, and a familiar smell every government building seems to have. A mix of dust, floor polish, and stale air conditioning. Bryce looked completely comfortable, at least at first. He walked to the podium, carrying his notes, and launched into another one of his speeches. According to him, the neighborhood was under attack. He talked about preserving standards, protecting property values, eliminating disruptive influences. At one point, he even referred to certain residents as a cancer within the community. Then he started clicking through slides. Photos of our house, photos of our yard, photos of the ramp he had ordered destroyed. He presented them like evidence in a criminal investigation, completely blind to the fact that he was exposing his own character more than ours. When he finally finished, I stepped forward, My hands were shaking, but once I started talking, the words came naturally. I told him about the sound of the bulldozer arriving before sunrise. I told him about standing helplessly in the yard while strangers tore apart something built to give my sister independence. I told him what it felt like to watch a disabled woman be treated like a problem instead of a person. And I told him what it does to someone's soul when they're informed that their dignity has become a violation notice. For the first time since all of this started, nobody looked away. Nobody checked their phone. Nobody stared at the floor. People listened, really listened. Then the mayor stood up. He walked slowly to the microphone and cleared his throat. The room immediately quieted. "There is one more guest I'd like to introduce today," he said. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. "Please welcome Governor Delilah Morrison." The reaction was instant. It felt like every bit of oxygen vanished from the building. You could actually hear people gasp. And Bryce? I've seen concrete handle stress better than that man did. In the span of 5 seconds, his face cycled through every color imaginable. First white, then bright red, then a sick gray around the mouth. It looked like his entire understanding of reality had just collapsed. Meanwhile, Delilah calmly rolled her wheelchair forward. Cameras turned toward her like sunflowers following sunlight. She stopped near the microphone and folded her hands, completely composed, completely in control. "Mr. Kellerman," she began. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You've spent the last 3 months systematically targeting and harassing a disabled resident while your association continued accepting public funding that requires ADA compliance and anti-discrimination protections." The room was silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then she glanced toward the back of the room. "I'm sure the investigators behind you can explain the rest." And just like that, the trap closed. Several people stood up throughout the audience. Not residents. Investigators. Attorney General staff. State auditors. Federal compliance officials. People Bryce had never bothered to notice. Reporters immediately surged forward. Questions started flying from every direction. Board members who had looked so confident earlier suddenly appeared desperate to disappear into their chairs. Bryce tried defending himself. When that didn't work, he started arguing. When arguing failed, he started shouting. Then came accusations, claims of political retaliation, claims of abuse of power, claims that everyone was conspiring against him, which was particularly amusing coming from a man who had used a bulldozer to enforce his personal authority. The louder he became, the worse he looked. Eventually, security stepped in. They escorted him toward the exit, while he continued ranting and pointing fingers. The moment the doors closed behind him, the room erupted. People stood. People clapped. People cheered. The standing ovation lasted so long that it stopped feeling like applause and started feeling like relief. A week later, the neighborhood gathered to rebuild Delilah's ramp. This time I wasn't working alone. Nearly 50 neighbors showed up. There were stacks of lumber, toolboxes, extension cords, folding chairs, coolers full of drinks, barbecue smoke drifting through the summer air, kids running across lawns while adults worked side by side. It felt less like construction and more like a community remembering who it used to be. We built the new ramp stronger than the original, wider, safer, better in every way. People laughed. People cried. Old arguments disappeared. Pete donated hardware. Several contractors volunteered labor. Mrs. Morgan documented the entire project from her kitchen window again. Only this time she was recording something worth celebrating, not evidence. Joy. As for Bryce, reality arrived quickly. Fraud investigations, civil rights violations, financial audits, restitution orders, criminal charges, eventually prison time, an entire parade of consequences he had spent years believing only happened to other people. His contractor friends vanished almost overnight. His allies abandoned him. His carefully constructed little kingdom collapsed in full public view. And Riverside Heights? It changed too. The fear disappeared. People started talking to one another again. Neighbors helped neighbors. Property values continued rising despite all Bryce's warnings. Turned out communities do just fine when residents feel respected, protected, and safe. Funny how that works. So before I go, I want to ask you something. When someone uses rules and procedures to strip another person of dignity, is simply following the law enough? Or do decent people have a responsibility to make sure justice actually reaches the people standing on the ground? Let me know what you think. Who was right? Who crossed the line? And have you ever dealt with someone who hid behind policies and procedures because they thought it made cruelty look respectable? I'd really like to hear your story.